the big unlock of our business and especially our newsletters is we're basically looking for a unicorn every time, 5,000 to 7,000 filled out forms of that application. There have only ever been 12 people that we thought could actually touch the newsletter.
To run a company, you have to be self-aware.
Every time I have a business idea that I think is somewhat interesting, I put it out on social. If my risk is 1 out of 500,000 people following me are going to do that, I'm willing to go along that risk every single day.
If we don't have any competitors, like in 12 to 18 months, we're
in the wrong market. Yeah. If you can cover your name and replace it with any other person's name, it probably means that it's not high specificity enough and it doesn't pull from enough lived experience. What is the cost of you not believing in yourself, of you not believing you have the tools to create any outcome you want to create?
You're the author here. You get to write a whole different story if you want to. Well, hello, everyone. It's Jim O'Shaughnessy with yet another Infinite Loops. I have been looking forward to talking to today's guest for a very long time. I think we will have a lot to talk about, and we have a lot of shared vibes, I would call them. My guest today is Alex Lieberman, the founder and former CEO of Morning Brew, and he also has a new company, Storyarb, which we're going to talk about in a minute. Alex, man, I love you.
I love you too. Thanks so much for having me.
Your path to me was just so cool and interesting because it highlights a lot of things that I often, when I'm giving advice to people and, about writing, write for yourself, write for one person, do it in an entertaining manner. And you do all of that and more. If you wouldn't mind, for the very, very few of our listeners and watchers who don't know about Morning Brew, can you give us the origin story? Because I think it's so cool.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks again for having me. Pumped to do this. One thing I will say about origin stories that are very interesting is you say them so many times that your memory of the story or your memory of the origin is the story you've told versus the origin. So I cannot confirm nor deny if this is the actual origin of Morning Brew because I've now repeated it 1,000 times and I may just be saying the story. But my memory of Morning Brew is, at the University of Michigan. I went to Michigan, quick context on my background. I went to Michigan after growing up in a suburb of New Jersey. And I went to a private school in New Jersey from 3rd grade to 12th grade. Didn't like my private school experience much, and I wanted something very different. Michigan was about as different as it got. I was the first person in 7 years to go to Michigan. And I always dreamed of working on Wall Street. I come from a Wall Street family. My dad was a mortgage trader for Citigroup. My mom ran the repo desk at Nomura. My grandpa ran fixed income at Prudential. So I didn't know anything other than Wall Street. And it's funny because growing up, my dream was to be the world's greatest trader. Yet I had no idea what that meant. I just knew I wanted to be like my mom and dad. And so the Michigan path was very much just the next step on this journey to reach that pinnacle. So I was in the business school at Michigan, did the classic internship thing after each year. After my junior year of college, I interned for Morgan Stanley, interned on the agency mortgage-backed security trading desk. I got a job offer. So I get into my senior year at Michigan, have my job lined up that I was going to do after college, had all this free time. And basically I was spending way too much of my time playing FIFA or NHL on Xbox. And I was like, I need to do something to keep my brain sharp for when I go back to the trading desk. And I started writing a daily business newsletter, partially driven by my desire to not basically lose all of my knowledge around the markets. And the other reason was I was helping students prepare for job interviews. I would always ask them, how do you keep up with the business world? Every student would say, I read the Wall Street Journal, but it's dense, it's dry. My parents told me to do it, so I do it. And I was writing this newsletter. The original newsletter was not called Morning Brew. It was called Market Corner. It was a PDF that I would put together every day. So I'd literally go to Microsoft Word. I'd go to the template builder. I'd select a newsletter template. I'd write the thing. It would take me 4 hours a day. There was no logo for the company. I ripped off a logo from Google of a bear and a bull fighting that still had the watermark going across. And there was no website. You were incapable of signing up. If you wanted to sign up for the newsletter, you had to reach out to me personally and say, hey, Alex, can you punch in my email address to your listserv? So that's what I did by myself for 2 or 3 months. Yet it somehow worked. After 2 or 3 months of doing it, 300 or 400 people were subscribed, which at the time was impressive to me because it was impossible to sign up for the thing. I sent out an email to that list saying, I'm thinking about taking this project a little bit more seriously. Does anyone want to help? One of the first emails I got was from this guy named Austin Reef, who was in the business school at Michigan, was actually in the same fraternity as me, but we didn't know each other. And he was like, yeah, I'm interested in this. I have ideas for how to make this thing better. We met up in the business school. And from the get-go, I was just fascinated by Austin's brain. Like, we could not be more different thinkers, or at least our default setting for how we think is very different. And so I brought Austin on basically after a week of talking as a co-founder for this thing that we didn't even think about as a business yet. And I think that's the beauty of this thing is we didn't think about it as a business for basically a year and a half. We launched the first Morning Brew as a proper email newsletter with a proper landing page in the beginning of 2015, which was my second semester senior year at Michigan, Austin's sophomore year. We launched the thing, and then, how long? 8 years later, here we are today.
What amazes me about it is it illustrates, I think, quite nicely the idea that you did that because you wanted to do it. It was you were interested in it. You didn't think, oh, I'm gonna do a startup and I'm gonna get VCs to fund it. I'm gonna do all. No, what you did was, Jesus Christ, and I too, longtime reader of the Wall Street Journal. It's gotten better than it used to be.
Totally.
When I started reading, I'm an old, so I'm 63. When I started reading the Wall Street Journal, literally, Alex, it was nothing but text, and maybe if you got lucky, a little line drawing, and it was, to put it charitably, dry.
Totally.
And one of the things that really appeals to me about you and your story is we are seeing this huge shift. I call it the Great Reshuffle, but like all the old playbooks, they don't work anymore. They're collapsing. And things like Morning Brew are taking advantage of that. Like, there's a ton of people who want to know about business news, right? But they want to be entertained at the same time.
Yep.
And was that the secret sauce?
Yeah, so it's interesting. It's funny when I think about the Wall Street Journal, for a while, the way we would kind of frame in our brain how we would create Morning Brew is, for anyone who's listening, if you pick up a physical Wall Street Journal, what you'll always have is front page of the paper on the left side, you'll have this yellow column that basically is kind of like the highlights. And we were like, what if our newsletter was basically just the yellow column and it read like your smart and sociable, non-douchey friend was talking to you over drinks, over a beer at home. Like, that was kind of the vibe. And it's funny, we thought about voice from day one. Like, the real thing was, we didn't know a lot about media at all. And it was a blessing of all the things that we didn't know. That's really what gave us the ability to build this business. But from day one, we basically said, this has to read like your smart friend that's talking to you, not like a robot that's spitting information at you. And it kind of naturally took that form because in the beginning I was writing the thing. And it's so funny today that like I create content on the internet, I build audience because I was a horrible writer growing up. I was actually horrific. And so the fact that like writing is one of the things I'm considered to be good at now is kind of hilarious to me. But Austin and I would write this newsletter, and we didn't know anything better than just writing like we spoke. And I think the big failure that a lot of writers have is they don't write like they speak. They write like they're taught to write in journalism school or whatever. And then at some point, Austin and I were like, okay, we're fine at this. We're like a B or a B plus, but we need to start spending our times on growth, like actually getting more subscribers to the newsletter. And we think there are people who could better execute on the writing of this thing. And so we set up this kind of crazy system when we were at Michigan, and we used this system for probably 2 years before raising a little bit of money and hiring our first full-time writer. And the system was, we got college students who were subscribed to Morning Brew, who had some editorial experience, to write stories for our newsletter. So on any given day, 2 or 3 people would write the stories of our newsletter. And then we said to ourselves, those are going to be pretty good, but we need an editor. So we found a guy who both was wrote for the Michigan newspaper, but also was working, did internships in finance, so knew the markets well. He was basically our editor of Morning Brew. So he would assign stories and then he would copy edit them. But then the third piece that I don't think any companies had ever done or thought of at the time, but this was just less like us linearly thinking about how do you add voice? We said, he's a good editor. He'll get these pieces to flow well, but there's still no voice. How do we add voice? And so Austin and I literally created a job description of voice editor. That was the name of the job. And we went to Michigan and we found the one guy who could add voice to any story. And it was a guy who was he majored in business, but he also was in the improv troupe at Michigan. And he basically would take every finished story for our newsletter for a year and a half straight, and he would add voice to it. And we codified what this voice is. We literally described if Morning Brew is a person, how old are they? What are their interests? What do they do on weekends? What's their go-to cocktail? What are things they say versus don't say? And this was his kind of his key for being able to edit effectively. And all of those college students in the early days, they did it for free to get exposure in front of an existing audience. And then the editor and the voice editor, we gave, I think, like a point of equity to in the early days of that business. And then eventually we bought them out of it. And I think one of the cool stories is one of those guys, he literally paid for business school with just that point of equity from the brew.
How cool is that? Did you ever find that there was somebody whose voice was so different? Like, how do you assess somebody's writing ability, their voice? Did you find yourself going, when you were adding writers to it, did you have the voice in your head when you were reading what they were writing, or were you happy with the voice editor being able to work his magic?
Yeah. So I would say for the period of time where we were still in some context I should have provided in the beginning is we were part-time on it, right, while we were students at Michigan. And then I graduated from Michigan and I worked actually on Wall Street trading mortgages for a year. And then I quit my job. And so basically from 2015 until September of 2016, the period where we were doing it part-time, that's when we kind of had this system running. And while we had this system, I would say we were vetting college students for being really good at being interested in what's happening in the business world and being able to synthesize it into the most important points of like, why does this matter to me as a young business person? And to write with some level of like what I would just call like strong writing chops, like good sentence structure, good flow, etc. The voice editor we kept the whole time. Now, the hard part became when I quit my job in 2016 and we raised a small amount of funding. We raised $750K from family and friends. And the first hire we made was a writer, because Austin and I were like, we're not going to be the best writers of this. We need to hire a writer, and we can't have this college system now that we're full-time. Finding a writer, one full-time writer who could do all of these things was exceptionally difficult. It was exceptionally, like that is, I think, the big unlock of our business and especially our newsletters is we're basically looking for a unicorn every time. And we still have the same process today, which is we had a Google form where we'd say to someone, pick one business news story that you think the modern business leader needs to know about in order to not be caught off guard in a conversation, and synthesize that story into 150 to 200 words and write it with a voice that comes off as this smart and sociable friend having a conversation with another 20-something-year-old. And I would say over the years, we've probably gotten 5,000 to 7,000 filled out forms of that application. There have only ever been 12 people that we thought could actually touch the newsletter. And it's interesting. We'll talk about it in a little bit, but with Storyarb, the same type of thing I've realized has happened, which is it is literally like a 1 in 1,000 selection process of writers, because it's so hard, right? You're looking for someone who's just a news junkie, someone who has great writing chops. But the issue is writing chops combined with voice is always very difficult. Because, for example, there's a lot of journalists that have great writing chops, but unfortunately, voice has been trained out of them in J school. So you need to find someone who writes with voice, almost like a comedy writer or a late night TV writer, but also has like the fundamentals of writing. And by the way, that's why in the early days of Morning Brew, one of the kind of like places we would do outbound outreach for people to ask them if they want to apply for the job is we go to every comedy club in the US, message them and say, if you have any people who perform stand-up or improv here who are looking for roles like full-time jobs, send them our job description.
And so can you enumerate the unicorn? What are the characteristics of that unicorn? Out of all the thousands of applications that you got, what were the consistent characteristics of the unicorns you hired?
Yeah, so I'll describe to me what like a unicorn story looks like, and then I'll describe what a unicorn candidate looks like. So to me, an exceptionally written story does a few things. It has the slippery slope that if anyone's ever read like the Adweek copywriting handbook, which is to me the best book on both copywriting, but in some ways also sales, because to me they're just different versions of storytelling. It has the slippery slope, which means the first sentence hooks you into the second, hooks you into the third, and so on. When I think about a great story, a great Morning Brew story, or any great story for that matter, it combines a few things. It's high specificity. So it is very good at painting a picture using specific examples, specific numbers that push the story forward. The example that I always use for why high specificity is so important is I used to listen to How I Built This a lot. And the episode I will always remember is the story of Sarah Blakely from Spanx, because there's a story she tells in there where she just got into Neiman Marcus and she was so excited, but they put her rack in the back left corner of the store where no one would see it. Every day for 100 days, she would go into the store, take the rack, put it by the cash register until on day 101, the store employees were like, maybe the general manager wants it to be here. I will never forget that story because of how specific she was. And it read like only Sarah could have told that story. And so to me, a great Morning Brew story reads as if only the Morning Brew logo could be associated with that story and no other company. So high specificity is one. Writing that dances is two. And one of the simplest ways to describe writing that dances is interesting word choice and sentence structure that isn't picked to sound smart or sophisticated, but it doesn't sound basic or something that has been read a billion times. The second way that you make writing dance is sentence length variation. There's a great example that David Perel has put out where he shows basically the same paragraph of writing. One is written where every sentence is the same length. The second paragraph, which has the same exact words, but there's variation in sentence length, and it reads completely differently. And the final piece to a great Morning Brew piece is at the end of the day, it's not just about saying, what is the story that's going on in the world right now? So it's not just, what is the story about, Tesla hitting its production numbers in Q4? It's like, why should I actually give a shit as an informed professional and potentially an informed investor? So that's how I think about creating a great story at the Morning Brew level. In terms of a great writer, to be honest with you, I just think about who are our best writers we've had at Morning Brew for a while. And our managing editor, his name's Neil. He's been at the business for 6 years. So he was our third employee ever. And now he runs the entire newsletter team, has writers who work alongside him. And he actually is now the co-host of our daily show that we launched. And I think what makes Neil so exceptional is that he has the most insatiable curiosity for reading the internet and finding like weird and wonky things. Like I think about the reason he's so good at writing a story is not just because he writes the story, but he weaves in other aspects of business culture that are just in his brain because he's in this always on consumption mode of what's happening in the world. And the second thing to me is like, he is just great at high specificity and high flow. And just to kind of round it out, never was traditionally trained in writing, never went to journalism school. The only writing experience he ever had was writing for University of Maryland's newspaper, and that was it.
That's wild because I have found very similar things in writers that I really love to read. Very, very, and it's a little known fact that newspaper men, as they called them back in the day, because there were very few newspaper women, but most of them, like their backstories were hysterical, right? Some of them didn't even graduate high school. Virtually none of the greats like Macon and others trained in classic journalist techniques. It was like literally the really cool multi-interested person. And did we does journalism school just crank that curiosity and that newness out of you?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know for sure since I didn't go to J school, but I would say that I do think that for whatever it does, it makes people write for themselves versus write for their audience in a really interesting way. Now, look, there are some journalists whose writing I absolutely love. Like, I'm a huge fan of Barry Weiss's writing. I'm a huge fan of other journalists as well. But also, again, when I think of my favorite writers, I think of like Ben Thompson. I think of Packy McCormick. I think of David Perell. All of these people not traditionally trained. I think it is easier. Like the easier path is to be a good writer who's wildly interested and interesting, who becomes a better writer than an exceptional writer who's not deeply intellectually curious and interesting, who tries to become more interesting or deeply intellectually curious.
Yeah, I that is my own experience. I was lucky enough to have the curiosity part way down, but was not trained as a writer. I was the editor of my high school newspaper and loved to write. But my wife was trained in journalism, graduated summa cum laude with a journalist degree. And I'll always remember the first thing I wrote for publication. I was trying to get Barron's to publish a piece I wrote in the early 90s. And I wrote it and I gave it to my wife and I said, "Could you look at this for me, please?" And like literally, it came back and it was nothing but a sea of red. And it was like, and then she hands it to me and I look at it and I look at her and she just gets this little smile on her face. And I went, so she goes, "So that is maybe the worst thing I've ever read in my life. It is dry as dust. It reads like an academic who failed at being an academic. Why should I be interested in anything you're saying here?" And of course, back then, much thinner skin, I got so pissed. We were on a train going into the city and literally we got in this huge fight with me saying, "Yeah, you don't care about, the domain knowledge that I'm trying to get across here." And she's like, "No, I honestly don't. I want you to tell me an interesting story. And this doesn't do it. Rewrite this fucking thing and give me something that I can actually work with." Totally. like literally, I didn't speak to her for the rest of the train ride.
That is incredible. I know it's the most interesting thing is I think that that is our natural way. That is our natural way of communicating information to people. And I think it's taught out of us, right? Like, just even if this is a very meta example, but if you were to just listen back to the last minute of our conversation, the way that you just illustrated this lesson of good writing to me was telling the story with your wife. And it was a far better way for me to learn that lesson than you to actually try to methodically and kind of scientifically break down what it looks like to tell a good story. And so it's in all of us. I believe it is taught out of us.
I agree. And one of the things that it actually helped me immensely, because it kind of gave me the freedom to, okay, you know what, Missy, when I stopped being mad at her, I said, you're right. Completely rewrote it, gave it to her, read it, she came in. Still lots of red, to be honest, but it was essentially, now you made me care. And she handed it to me. And literally, most of her corrections were much better than me. And so that was the piece that I submitted. Ultimately got published. It was the first piece I ever got published professionally. And what it taught me was you've got to thicken up your skin here, buddy, because if you're going to write, you are just inviting everyone to, remember the gift, actually.
That is incredible. Totally.
Actually to death, right?
Totally. And to be honest, the thing I always say to, this is a different context than Morning Brew, but when I'm talking to people who either are starting to write, internet essays or build their brand online, I'm like, the number one test really to know if you have written something that people are going to enjoy is there's kind of two criteria. It's one, could a fifth grader understand this? Because I truly believe if you cannot write something for the fifth grade reading level, you're not explaining things simply enough, which probably means you don't understand it well enough. And the second thing I would say is, if you can cover your name and replace it with any other person's name, it probably means that it's not high specificity enough and it doesn't pull from enough lived experience.
I love that rule. I didn't know that one, so thank you. I will be instituting that. All of my writers at O'Shaughnessy Ventures are going to be delighted with that one.
Yeah, no, but it'll be interesting. Like if you even do a test, like go through your own Twitter and kind of cover your name and ask yourself, could someone else have written this? I know if I do that for myself, there are so many that the answer would be no, someone else could have written this. And I think it's a really good litmus test.
I agree. On the idea of finding that kind of unique unicorn, we're supporters of David Perell's rite of passage.
Yep.
We big believers in like writing has never been more important, not less. And so my question becomes, is that something you can learn? Is that something you can train into somebody?
Oh, I think that everyone can be taught to be better at writing. So I believe that. But I do believe there are certain innate abilities that have to live within you to be an exceptional writer. So I think every person can be trained to be a good writer. I think there are born traits that make people exceptional writers, and I don't think everyone has them. And I think honestly that goes for not just writing, that goes for any career. The way I would think about it is like Morgan Housel is an exceptional writer. I do not believe that if Morgan Housel didn't have certain qualities in him, his way of thinking, his way of thinking about kind of like having this natural intuition around like the arc of a story, I don't believe that he would be an exceptional writer. But also you look at Morgan Housel and he wrote 3,500 pieces when he was at Motley Fool. So he put it basically, I almost like the way that I view this is if you had 100 people in a lineup who wanted to be writers, I view it as like there's a ceiling, like say like the ceiling, almost like if I'm looking at like a player's baseball card and the ceiling is like a 100%. That is the very best you could be. I would say that each person on that line is going to have a ceiling and they're going to vary. For a few, it's 100%. For some, it's like 70%. And I think it's the amount of effort, intentional effort you put in and get you closest to your ceiling. But I do believe people are born with 100% ceiling versus 70% ceiling.
Yeah. Fun story. I tried to coach Morgan and come have him work for me before he was anointed as the sage of Seattle. And he quite intelligently turned me down. It's like, yeah, no, I'm very happy doing what I'm doing over here. But you're right. I think that like one of his gifts is to take something that, just in the thought process or on the page, kind of like, yeah, okay, I get that. But then he flips it on you and makes it like, and kind of shocks you a little bit, right? In the way he puts the story together. He does that with public speaking as well, which is a very interesting trait. One of the things that I did, so I've written 4 books, but the book I'm best known for is What Works on Wall Street, which I intentionally wrote in a dry style. Why did you do that, Jim? I once was giving a speech, right, about what works on Wall Street. And I give lots of examples and tell lots of stories and everything. And a guy came up to me afterwards holding the book. He looked at me and he was dead serious. He goes, "You cannot be the same Jim O'Shaughnessy who wrote this fucking book."
Hilarious.
Do you find
so why did you do that? Why did you write it in that manner?
Because it was such a data dump of so many different things about what the book did. Was like everyone talks about, hey, buy low PE stocks or buy stocks with the best growth. And I was sitting there in the early 90s saying, where's the proof? Like, I hear all these things. All these interviews with the asset managers, they're saying the same thing, but is there any empirical proof that what they're saying actually is right or not? And so that's how I got the idea for writing the book. And because we were going to be covering so much, I had to standardize, right?
Yep.
And to do that, it put me in that drier place.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But by the way, one thing I would say to that is we wrote Morning Brew in a very voicey way because we thought at the time, the college student who's interested in business, it is important for them. But I think something to also keep in mind is like, not all content is meant to be voicey. Like I look at content on kind of the spectrum of what percent information versus what percentage entertainment is it. So let's say Morning Brew is, I'm just going to use a number. Let's say it's, I don't know, 70% information, 30% entertainment. As we went into other newsletters, so after Morning Brew, we branched off into industry-specific newsletters like Marketing Brew, Retail Brew, et cetera, for industry professionals and job functions. And as we thought about, let's just say Retail Brew, our calculus for voice changed for the audience. So it became, we're going to be 85% information, 15% entertainment. Why? Because the person reading Retail Brew, first of all, their reference point is existing retail trade publications, which are literally 100-0. And so we don't have to differentiate all that much to be very meaningful. But also, they're not coming to us necessarily to make themselves like smile and laugh a ton. They want to get the information that helps them be better at their job.
Yeah, I agree. And I was coming at it from a Wall Street, very specific point of view, right? And if you know anything about Wall Street, you know most Wall Streeters are really funny. And they are, I mean, to the point where like literally the first time I ever heard a joke was from a fellow Wall Streeter. And I remember the day I'm moving out of one house into the next house and I'm packing up boxes and the space shuttle blowing up disaster happened. And like, I heard it on I had a radio on and I heard it on the radio. I'm like, oh my God, that's awful. My phone rings and landline back then, my friend.
There we go.
I pick up the landline and it's a buddy of mine on the street who says, I said Bud Light.
Oh my God. Oh my God. That is like, incredible.
Wall Street is the king and queen of too soon.
Yes. Oh, without a doubt. Yeah. It's, yeah, to your point, it's like, there is a very specific type of humor by people that are working on trading desks or in investment banks. And it is the definition of mistimed humor.
Totally.
I love that.
But the idea was that it did get me thinking about like, because I passionately agree with you. And anything that I write that I really am happy with, I'm writing it basically for myself. Let's be honest. Yep. Something I'm interested in, and you can just tell, like, write this, no interest, like, right? And it just bleeds off the page that you have no interest in what you're talking about. And then when you add in the voice, which I think is the right way to think about it, it just comes alive. You know, Lulu Maservi, who does PR. I had her on the podcast and like, she is the queen of the, hey, fuckface, the world is a whole different place now. You know, corporate speak, jargon, etc. It only, people are just going to laugh at you. I think about it like, you know, I'm sure you're familiar with the campaign that those wonderful people over the World Economic Forum are trying to do. Yep. And like, they're spending millions and they're so tone deaf, so at odds with what regular people are thinking about these issues that I just, I'm like, to me, they're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on meme creation, but not the memes that they want.
Totally.
Basically the opposite.
Yeah. I mean, it is so interesting to me that like this is a recent phenomena because people have always been people. So it's just such an interesting thing, like culturally what's changed that people don't want to be spoken to, or they now want to officially be spoken to like people versus 20 years ago when they were still people and wanted to be spoken to like people. But I also think it brings up this question, which is like, you know, you have kind of very gracefully managed this balance of both like being a successful industry professional while creating content on the internet and building audience. And I think it is not only wildly impressive, but I'm sure you've seen like building audience has been probably very additive to your life and to your career. And so I think people get very excited by that. But, people come to me a lot of times and be like, Alex, I want to build my personal brand on the internet. I've seen so many people do it. I've seen people raise funds off of it. I've seen it drive customers. How do I start doing it? And honestly, like the first question I always ask people is like, do you enjoy doing it? Like, do you actually enjoy creating content and having your brain always kind of like scanning for ideas, et cetera? Because it is a muscle and it is a skill. And it's like, I think about it like a different form of entrepreneurship where if you don't like the thing, it is going to be absolutely miserable to be a content creator for an extended period of time. Like you're just not going to do it. And by the way, like that's one of the ways that I figured out that creating content and building audience is something I can do for my whole career and that I'm pretty good at, because oftentimes it's really hard to know like your specific superpowers. You'll know a few, but sometimes you'll be blind to others, because the best way to actually know your superpowers is you ask someone, what are your thoughts on this skill set? And when they basically say it is horrific, like I was talking to a guy the other day and he's like, there's two fears I have in the world. One is skydiving and one is writing content on the internet that other people see. You actually start to get a sense of, do you like the thing and are you good at the thing? Because it just doesn't feel like that to you.
Yeah. I immediately flashed on the Austin Powers thing where his dad is there. And I can't, this is the wrong quote, but there are two things I can't stand: intolerance and the Dutch.
Yes. So good. You're just an absolute reference machine, which also makes you a great writer. Like that, going back before to what I was saying about Neil, our writer at the Brew, and like kind of always being in culture and having like the in culture joke. Like that is a skill set in itself, is to like know those things. It's like why also I listen to like, when I listen to Sam Parr and Sean Puri, it's like what I think makes Sean a great co-host of that podcast is there's always some story or reference that other people will get, especially oftentimes that like they've thought about themselves, but it's never been stated out loud, that I think is such an incredible skill and one that is very hard to teach.
Yeah. And some of that, you mentioned Morgan writing all the pieces for the Motley Fool, right? So some of that just comes from duration. As I said, I'm 63. So I have my huge advantage, honestly, is like I have 30 years more of cultural references than younger people, right?
Totally.
And that's a huge advantage, right? Because
but I will
they're
say
seeing it the first time and they love it.
Totally. But what I will say also is I think the hard thing that I think you've been able to bridge is as you age, keeping resonance with a young audience. I think it's just difficult, right? Because, I think about it for my cousin's age. She's like, in high school, and the way that high schoolers engage with content today, and like they're addicted to YouTube in a very specific way. Like, that's not the way I ever grew up. So it's like I need to somehow learn those habits. And so I think, to your point, the fact that you have 30 years of stories, but like you also understand like the meme that the 30-year-old finds hilarious today is like the skill in itself.
Yeah. And that's on my list too. It's like Vonnegut said to John Irving when they were both teaching at the same very prestigious writer colony, I think in Iowa. Basically along the lines of something, of course you could write in a serious tone, but if you're going to write in a serious tone, you better be fucking entertaining too. Right. And I think I that really resonates with me though, because like, honestly, with the tsunami of stuff that's coming, I mean, wait, people who thought that was like a few years ago. Oh no, my friend.
Yep.
The tsunami of information that's going to be coming is going to be just like something we've never seen. So you've got to have that edge, whatever way you can find it. And to your point, I think that the more you can make it about what you naturally lean into, something you say actually, move towards things that energize you, don't deplete their energy. Another thing you say a lot is basically good writers, good CEOs to run a company, you have to be self-aware. talk about that a little bit, because the people that are the most fun to make fun of, like, again, the folks at World Economic Forum, they have zero self-awareness.
Least self-aware, totally. Yeah, what I always say is, whether this is like a CEO that I want to work with on a new company that I'm spinning up, or a new hire that I'm making, is I would way rather, so if I could choose between two people that I'm hiring into a job, one person has, let's say, 95% relevant job experience. Like, they've done 95% of the job that I'm hiring them into, but they are woefully unaware. They don't know their blind spots. They don't know what they're not good at. They don't know what they should delegate towards because they think they're good at everything. Say the second person is only at like 45% or 50%, but they are incredibly self-aware. I will hire vast majority of time the second person. And my reason is at some point, the company you're building is going to grow outside of the person A's competency. So sure, day one, they've done 95% of the job, but what about 2 years from now, where they no longer can pattern match everything, and now their relevant skills are like 30%, but they have no ability to grow into that 70%. And so, yeah, like, I mean, I feel so grateful that I in my own career have been able to identify, like, what are the 1 to 3 things that I love doing, that I think I'm good at. And I genuinely believe that everything other than those 3 things, I can find someone else that is significantly better than me, that enjoys the thing significantly more. And I couldn't imagine a life in which I wasn't constantly looking for those things to give to other people, because honestly, I would be the bottleneck to everything in my life. And so, yeah, that is like probably number one for any, like, for Storyarb, the CEO I brought on, for any business that I start moving forward and I bring on a co-founder. It's like, basically, when I ask the question of them, I actually love asking the question, like, what are your biggest weaknesses? Everyone hates that question because they're like, people are going to use a fake weakness. But I actually, like, to me, if you can basically say, if you tell me a fake weakness, I'm actually going to view that as a weakness on your part, because it tells me that you're not self-aware of your weaknesses. I think things actually get very interesting.
I agree. And like, when I was briefly at Bear Stearns, they let me interview potential intern candidates exactly one time, because I think most interview processes actually lead to worse outcomes if you follow them.
Yep.
And like, there's a joke. I use this joke as kind of a sorting mechanism, right? And it's a guy who's got to figure out what interns to hire, and his assistant brings in 50 of their resumes and sets them on the table. And the assistant says to him, "Dude, you got to get through these because, they're due like at the end of the week." And he looks at his assistant and he goes, Hey, Jack. And he goes, "Yeah, what?" He goes, "Randomly pick 25 of those and throw them in the trash." And Jack looks at him like, "Are you crazy, man? These people work so hard on all of this. You don't really want me to do that." And he looks at him and he goes, "Yeah, I do, because I'm lazy and I don't like hiring unlucky people."
That is so absurd. But yeah, to your point, I don't know what the business is, but there is something to do around how broken the interview process is. Like, I've even thought about going back to like blind spots. I realized in the early days of Morning Brew that I had a very clear blind spot or bias in my way of interviewing, meaning I would always interview and I'd have a better feeling towards people who had a similar personality to me. People who were more extroverted, who are very articulate, people who, like, honestly would be known as the person who crushes an interview because they're a good storyteller. But there's actually an irony to all of this, because actually potentially the best candidates are the ones that can't do that. Because if they've gotten a job in the past and they were a shitty interviewer, it actually probably means their work is really good. It's like when you're choosing between doctors and you're talking to two surgeons, one is like this really good looking guy who is a former model, has beautiful hands. And the second guy is like a schlub who, like, you're like, I would be afraid of this man holding a knife. You actually probably should go with the second guy.
Totally. I actually had surgery not too long ago, and that's how I picked the surgeon. I'm like, okay, you're here, which means you're amazing. You don't really look the part. I'm going with you all day long.
Exactly.
And that was my first hire at the first company that I started, O'Shaughnessy Capital Management. I just had lunch with him yesterday. Great guy named Chris Lovelace. But the reason I hired him, he was good at everything I totally sucked at.
Yep.
Right. And it was just like, I knew that I sucked at that. And like, he checked the list just all the way down.
Totally. And honestly, that's what I feel. So like, I really think the best decision, there were I think two decisions that are rank 1 and 2 for the best decisions I ever made in Morning Brew. One was bringing on my co-founder, Austin. The second was firing myself out of the CEO role and making Austin the CEO. And I think I feel so like, I think the skill in hiring Austin that I had, the little skill I had, because it wasn't like a formal interview process. We talked for a week. Like, there were so many reasons that it could have been the wrong decision because I was not rigorous with it. But the little skill was me just identifying what you talked about with Chris Lovelace, which is Austin's brain was completely complementary to mine. I was the person who was always thinking in terms of the next new idea. How are we going to sell investors on getting involved in the brew? How are we going to sell employees on joining the brew? How are we going to sell advertisers? Like if you've ever studied the EOS process, which is just like another version of OKRs, there's two people. There's the visionary and the integrator. And I think people live somewhere on the spectrum, but I like pretty squarely, especially when we were starting the business, sat in the visionary category. And Austin, which I didn't have the language for this at the time, Austin was the integrator. Like he was the most linear thinker I knew. He had better, just like clearer, deep thinking than still anyone I've ever met. Like I've met a lot of successful entrepreneurs. I think he's still like top 3 of any entrepreneur I've ever met. And so it was just like the way I always visualized it is like, I'm just like this insane racehorse, this thoroughbred that's running around the track. And Austin is the person who put the blinders around my eyes, and he's the jockey who's making sure I don't run into the railing for half the race.
Right. And the pushback I've gotten on that is like, okay, can you calm? I'm talking about myself. Like,
yeah.
Jim, will you like stop talking about the 24 things you just brought up in the last 15 minutes? Can we maybe like these 3 are interesting? So you're right.
Totally.
If you don't have that person, like you're just a whirling dervish. And you're like, God, man. And like you don't really get anything done. That's another thing. Like persistence, I think is something that's very admirable. I happen to be persistent, but I like seeing that in people I'm working with. And the way we kind of pervert, I guess, the old interview problem is we like to look at people as movies, not as snapshots, right? Like a snapshot, okay, if it's a great snapshot, ooh, let's hire this person. Wow, they're so good looking and this is such a great picture. But if the movie version of them, you see the before, right, and it's not so great. The idea of proof of work, is that getting easier now? Is that easier?
I was just talking to someone about this because I was just talking to actually a founder who's a client of Storyarb, and he's building a really interesting business that's in B2B SaaS. And one of the things he was talking about with me is just that hiring is really difficult, and it's so easy to hire the wrong people. And one thing that I said to him, which is true, is like, I am trying whenever possible now to go from contractor to full-time. Like whenever possible, I basically hire someone as a contractor to work on an actual project within the business. And after a month, I feel like I have so much more clarity around if they're the person, and they have so much more clarity of if we are the company. So like, for example, I did that with the CEO of Storyarb. And I think this can be done at any level. Like she was a contracting CEO for the business for a month. And so I was like, you're going to run this business as if you run the business for a month. And after this month, we'll learn one of two things. Either we weren't a good fit for each other, or you'll have this full-time CEO job, but we'll have a lot of clarity around it. And so I think that is something that I literally try to do as much as humanly possible. The second thing that maybe this is something that people don't agree with. I like making interview processes intentionally long. And I just think, going back to the point of persistence, someone who really wants the job is going to keep pushing through. And also, the longer you make the interview process, the more you give them aperture into, is this the type of work that I want to do? Are these the type of people I want to talk to? And so I actually like making an interview process uncomfortably long and making people self-select themselves out.
Yeah, I think giving the opportunity for people to self-select out is key. And you've just also described O'Shaughnessy Ventures hiring process. Everyone starts out, and we use 8 weeks, but they're there on a trial basis for 8 weeks, but for exactly the same reasons that you mentioned, right? It's like, we might be a bad fit for them. And it's like, I've run lots of businesses, and I've had to let a lot of people go. And the thing that really surprised me was, like, in 8 out of 10 cases, they knew they were wrong there, right? And
Totally.
Some of them just kind of like took it as a relief. And what's cool is you watch them go on to find where they fit much better, and they do really, really well. And so this idea, I got fired, or, that's not fair, that's bullshit. What you're doing, if you're doing it this way, you're giving people the opportunity to test you out as well.
Yep. Yeah, I think when I reflect on, within Morning Brew, what are the biggest mistakes that we made in hiring, or what was the cause of the biggest mistakes? I'd say one that comes to mind is having the wrong reference point. And I think this is something that people don't talk about enough. If someone is not doing a good job, or let's say you have an employee who has grown beyond their depth, they've reached their ceiling within the business. And so you're looking to hire someone new to come into the business. Well, the risk you run is, let's just say you require someone who's an SVP level, but your current person in the role is a director level. When you start interviewing VPs, they're going to seem incredible relative to the person you have now, but you don't even have the awareness that maybe you need 2 tiers higher, because anyone relative to the person you currently have is going to seem exceptional. And again, that's where I think contract to full-time could be a valuable mechanism as well. It's also where I think a valuable mechanism is you having awareness that maybe you have the wrong reference point, and you either have an advisory board or investors who have expertise in that area of the business that you call in to the interview process to help you understand if your reference point is going to skew you and still hiring someone too junior. I think the other thing is a rushed hiring process where, let's just say you have 3 candidates. Let's say you get down to the final 2, but there's one who stands far above the rest. You give that person an offer, and they end up rejecting the offer because they had another job and they go join that company. And so you're like, oh, it's fine. We'll go to person number 2 because they were also in the process. You hire that person. You realize the delta between your top one and them was actually huge. And you just realize in an effort to close out this hiring process, you've actually now set yourself back 6 months because it's going to take you 4 months to realize they're not the right person. And so, it's very, but I also think a lot of these things are just learned experience. I also think I can say these things until someone's blue in the face, but sometimes you just have to go through it, make the mistake, and you'll feel it so much more in your bones by doing that.
That brings up something that I passionately believe, and that is some of the best ways to do things and get things done. You can arbitrage all day long because you can shout them from the rooftops. And unless you go through it, unless you understand it intuitively, it does not matter, right?
Exactly.
When I was publishing What Works on Wall Street, I got a large investment bank tried to buy my small company, right? But the deal was, if we buy you, you can't publish this book. And I'm like, oh, that just doesn't work for so many levels, right? You guys don't understand. These aren't trade secrets here. These are all arbitrage opportunities. We're arbitraging human nature here, right?
Exactly.
And it's so interesting to me that dominant mindset still is dominant, right? Oh no, proprietary, secret.
Yeah. It's why, to be honest with you, it's something that I just love doing is every time I have a business idea that I think is somewhat interesting, I put it out on social, right? If you search, there's so many times I've written free business idea and I put out an idea. And the reason I do that is like, I only look at it as net positive. The net positive that comes out of it is it creates interesting discussion around this idea, or people who are already building it, and maybe I can partner with them on it or invest in it, and I don't have awareness around it already being created. People say like the downside is, oh, someone's going to take the idea and build the thing. But I think it goes back to like human nature, which is, okay, let's say there are, of my whole audience, there are 20 people who look at the idea and they're like, oh my God, Alex, that's genius. I've never thought about it. I'm going to drop everything that I'm doing in my life right now and build the thing. I think maybe of the 20, there are 3 or 4 people that actually have the tenacity to do the thing. Then I think of those 3 or 4 people, maybe there's one person who has both the skill set, the knowledge, and the tenacity. And if my risk is 1 out of 500,000 people following me are going to do that, I'm willing to go along that risk every single day.
Me too. And, it's just amazing to me that more people don't act like that. I mean, when we sold O'Shaughnessy Asset Management to Franklin Templeton, we were developing a thing called Canvas, which was kind of based on something that I had done earlier, a thing called Netfolio. But somebody said in the heat of these negotiations, right, oh, and we won't have any competitors. And like, that stopped me in my tracks. I went, whoa. If we don't have any competitors, like in 12 to 18 months, we're wrong.
In the wrong market. Yeah,
exactly. We're wrong.
Totally.
And this idea that you don't want competitors, no, God, you're wrong if you don't have competitors, right?
Yeah, it's so interesting. By the way, I'm interested in how you navigate this. Something you mentioned before was something similar to what I mentioned, which is like, I have a bazillion ideas. I'm like an idea machine, but that can be kind of jarring for a team, or like, if not put in the right structure, it can be counterintuitive to what you want to do. And we can talk about like, but how I'm thinking about building like my next businesses and kind of my stage outside of the brew is trying to kind of respect my creativity without holding me back. How do you think about, because like it sounds like you're similar in that regard, where you have a number of ideas. How do you like not hold back your creativity and your ideation around new things you can do within your businesses, but also not like, how do you not hold back that skill, but also make sure that skill doesn't hold back what you want to do with your businesses?
That's a great question. One of the things that I was lucky enough to get taught when I was really young by my grandfather, who was really successful, was it's what he called premeditating. And by that, what he meant was, I get an idea, and I do this with ideas too, and it's very helpful. So you get an idea, and then you basically premeditate. What are all the things that might happen if this idea works, right? That are good, but then you have another line. What are all the things that might happen that are bad if this idea works? And then you do it for the opposite as well, right? Like, are there good things that can come from me not pursuing this idea?
Totally.
Right. And you find out, and also you've got to write it down. You can't, it's not like me and you just bullshitting back and forth together. It's a process, and you got to do it in writing, because I think that's a different way of thinking, basically. I
love that.
And so it emerges very quickly when you're doing this process, right? Oh, I really don't have, this is a bad idea. That's a really bad idea. And
totally.
It's like the first 10 minutes. And then so you scratch that one off the list. But then as you continue, let's say you get one that's really good and it makes it all the way through, then I toss it into Slack, or when we're getting together with teammates, and like, what does everybody think? And
totally.
It's very easy, because again, there's a certain type of person who might like that particular idea. But what I really like in terms of pursuing, I'll give you an example. So we have infinite media, because we share a lot of your positions on where things are going, right? And so we hadn't even thought about book publishing, but all of a sudden it started to be like, well, duh, we should probably be in the book publishing business as well. What was great about it is, did the premeditation, it scanned really, really well. Of course, you idiot. It's like slapping me across the face. Why didn't you think I should have led with that, Mr. Author? But then when you get the positions for people who are very different people, but they all like it, but bring very different things to it. Like I like it for this, this, and this, and then all of a sudden, like it's just like a magic business plan develops. And
Yeah.
and Storyarb is a great example. One of the things that we're going to offer through Infinite Books are we completely agree with you in terms of there are people with great stories, great lessons, great everything, but they're too busy, right?
Yep.
Not anymore. We got writers. Yeah. We've got, you want a book, you want a Substack, you want a YouTube, you want a podcast. We could package all that up for you.
Exactly. And by the way, once you do that, you can also launch a business off of the back of the audience that you've built for the person.
Exactly. Yeah. And so one of the things, that's when I was preparing for you, I was already excited because I love your stuff, but I've got a great researcher, right? And so like he finds things that I had found. And one of the things that you said that I loved, and I hadn't seen it until just earlier today, you want to be the co-founder, but you don't want to be the CEO of any of this. Explain that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, you tell me how deep you want to go into this, because I think if I was to kind of tell the full story, it would have to go back to me stepping out of my role as CEO of Morning Brew and kind of my revelations in doing that. You want me to talk about that?
I do. Yeah. Let's go deep. I think that people can learn a lot from that.
Okay. So basically the long story short is me stepping out of the CEO role at Morning Brew was probably the hardest decision I've ever had to make in my life. And it was my emotional state for 6 to 12 months after making that move was probably the lowest I've ever been in my life. Like, honestly, the only thing I would say rivals that was 5th grade to 12th grade at my private school, being bullied and going to school every single day and not feeling safe. Like, it's one of those two. And so I'll talk about how I felt and then why I stepped out of the CEO role and what I learned from it. The way I felt stepping out of the CEO role, and by the way, I felt very alone in all of this because I never talked to other founders who have stepped out of their business. I had no idea. I didn't feel like this was normal, although I've now learned in many conversations with people that this is kind of like the most classic feeling that exited founders have. But I felt a few things. I felt a loss of identity. I felt like I didn't know who Alex Lieberman was outside of Morning Brew. The best analogy I can give for people who haven't experienced this feeling is if you can imagine what it's like for a professional football player who's played football literally since they were 4 years old, played 10 years in the NFL, they retire, and then they are like, what do I do now? What skills do I have now, et cetera? It's that feeling. The second big thing that I think created a really shitty emotional state is my motivation changed. I would say probably a year before I stepped out of the CEO role, my motivation on a scale of 1 to 10 felt like a 2, which felt very uncomfortable for me. Given the first 4 or 5 years of Morning Brew, my motivation felt like a 12 out of 10, and I wasn't sure why at the time. I think as I examine it, a lot of the reason is the things that motivated me in the early years of Morning Brew were no longer going to be the things that motivate me moving forward. I was obviously motivated by kind of partially my love for the game and love for building with Morning Brew, but I think there were 2 extrinsic motivators that played a huge role. One was a desire to make a lot of money, and there are reasons for that. One is, I never knew kind of my family's financial situation. I think because I didn't know that, I had a lot of stories about that, this scarcity mindset around money. The second is my dad passed away when I was a junior in college, and I felt this obligation to take care of my family, whether rational or not. So the first was money motivation. And we got to a point in Morning Brew's journey where I knew we were going to have some liquidity event at some point, and money was, there was no longer motivation to make money because I knew it was coming. The second was a desire to be liked, a desire to feel belonging, a desire to feel a part of something. I think that comes from my feeling of not being liked, not feeling safe, not feeling a part of anything basically for my entire formative years as a kid. And to me, building a business was like, it was the fast track to do that. Founders are respected. You build this audience on social. Your business is doing well. Everyone's going to respect and like you. And at some point, I think I realized also like that wasn't filling my cup. And so imagine if those things are taking up 80% of my motivation, those things deplete, all of a sudden 80% of what drives my motivation goes away. The third thing that I think made me feel really unhappy after leaving the brew is I questioned all of my skills. I had this story of myself that I got very lucky, that I was not skillful in building my company, that my co-founder was dragging me along for the 8 years. And so in leaving Morning Brew, my story to myself was the money I made from our exit was the only money I would ever make. So I have to protect it at all costs. And I have no skills to actually do this again. And I basically dealt with all of those feelings for like 12 months. And I got to a few places. As I came out of this, and by the way, like if kind of people are wondering, how do you emerge from like this kind of valley of despair? I think one of the ways is it's probably a good time. That time in my life, if you've ever felt that way, it's probably a good time to seek help or support in some form, whether it's peer support, whether it's a therapist, whether it's a coach, etc. I did all of the above during that period of time. But I think also time really is the best teacher. Like I felt so much emotion leaving the CEO role, and I think time is the best way to separate emotion from mind, or emotion from like intuition. And that just took months. I ended up getting to a place where I said to myself, Alex, when you think about what you loved, what you truly loved in this journey of building Morning Brew, what comes to mind? And basically everything that came to mind were the first 4 years of the business. It was the ideation of the company. It was the invention of the product. It was me storytelling and selling investors, employees, and brands. It was the feeling of like being in battle with 4 or 5 people as the underdogs against the 900-pound gorillas of media. Like those were the things that felt great to me. And so I basically said to myself, well, if I have the incredible privilege of deciding what I do in my time now, why don't I just do the exact things over and over and over? And so, my desire moving forward has been build infrastructure that allows me to do basically 3 or 4 things. Ideate businesses, talk to exceptional founders to help go through the idea maze for those ideas or find as potential CEOs for my new businesses, create content that gives me distribution to drive opportunities for my businesses, and to focus on helping increase the probability of my new businesses going from 0 to 1. Everything else I will give to someone else by having a CEO running the day-to-day of all these businesses. And that's kind of how I got to that point.
That's a fascinating story. And I guess 2 immediate questions. The first is, can somebody who doesn't have those first 2 things, right? Like your goal was to make a lot of money so that you could take care of things and your family. Yep. But you got that, right? So that led to the very thoughtful
Correct.
way that you exited. Is there a way somebody without that certainty, right? They don't know they're going to make a lot of money, or they, not sure. Can they approach it the same way, or you got to go through the other one first?
I think part of the question you're asking is like, can people in the beginning of their career or in kind of their first step before they've realized the extrinsics, like gotten the extrinsics, can they just be driven by intrinsics? And I think the answer is yes. I think there are people who are wired intrinsically to do things for their desire to be creative, curious, and grow, build connection, etc. And by the way, I actually think the intrinsics are the best long-term motivator, right? Because everything I just described, the extrinsics, I almost think about it as like a sprint versus a marathon. It's like the extrinsics are great at high horsepower for a short period of time. The intrinsics are the slow burn forever. So I do think it's possible. And I actually think a lot of, I don't know, in some ways, I feel like the extrinsics often are driven by these stories we've had for a long time in our lives, based on experiences we've had in our lives for in our childhood or early adulthood, right? It's like these stories I have are because things I experienced as a kid or a college student or a high schooler. It's interesting to think about what would be my drive if I didn't experience all of those things. So yes, I think it's possible. I think it's rare. But part of me is honestly, I'm partly on a journey to figure out how do you bring that out in people, their intrinsic drive to build, because to me, it is the healthiest, long-lasting version. And it's funny because for the longest time, I always said I loved hiring people who have a chip on their shoulder. Like, there's always the saying, like, chips on shoulders, put chips in pockets. And I think it's true. But I think the issue is when you hire someone who has a chip on their shoulder, they're deriving their happiness from someone else's reaction. And as soon as that person, say, gives them the reaction they want, then where's the chip on your shoulder? It goes away. And so I actually think chips on shoulders can be helpful for employees who are at your business for a period of time and maybe the chip never goes away. But I think if you're saying to yourself, like, you want to invest in an entrepreneur for every business they'll ever run, I think at some point that driver runs out. It runs out of steam. So I wish I had the answer to how do you channel intrinsic motivation? How do you allow people to basically conjure it from day one? But I think if I had that answer, I also would have done it. And so I'm still on the hunt for how do you do it?
Yeah. And I think that the differential between intrinsic and extrinsic is a really good one to look at. Because, like, for most of my adult life, even since starting as a teenager, I love the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. And one of the things, I also wrote letters to my kids starting when my son, who's the oldest in the family, was like 6 days old. And what was interesting was the quote that I used was from Lao Tzu. And that was, the quote basically was looking at intrinsic value versus extrinsic value.
Yep.
And Lao Tzu saying, yeah, if you have power over other people, yeah, you're powerful, but are you master of yourself? If you're looking for happiness outside of yourself, guess what? You're never going to find it. You're going to find it within yourself. And so that has always been kind of something that when I was looking for teammates, it's really hard to suss out, though, right?
Yeah. I have a few thoughts on this. I think,
please.
So by the way, one thought that came to mind is, while I don't have the answer for how do you drive intrinsic motivation, I think one of the best resources that I continue to read and like go deeper in, because I think it allows you to kind of locate where you're coming from. Like, because I think a lot of times people don't even have awareness of what is the thing that's driving them. And I think being able to locate it is the first step. There's this book called 15 Commitments of Conscious Leadership. I don't know if you've ever read it, but it's the best book on leadership I've ever read. I just continue to read. I'm always reading it. I'm always just referencing it. It's by this organization that's called the Conscious Leadership Group. My executive coach is trained in conscious leadership. And it basically talks about all of us are always existing either above the line or below the line. Above the line is operating from a place of love, curiosity, growth, and abundance. Below the line is from a place of fear, scarcity, defensiveness, etc. And basically it goes through how to both identify whether at any given time you're above the line or below the line, but also ways in which you can shift from below the line to above the line, as in extrinsic to intrinsic, or fear-based to growth-based. And I'm just going to give you an example because I was literally talking about this with my executive coach yesterday. And I think it was really powerful for me because I don't think people realize actually the downside of being extrinsically driven or fear driven. Like, I think people rationally understand that, okay, maybe this motivation will only last for a period of time, but I don't think people actually realize the cost that it has on their life. And so I'll explain what I mean. Something that I brought up with my executive coach is that I feel a great deal of anxiety every single day. I think about it. of how much I have to pay him. I shared this with him. It's the most I've ever spent on like personal growth. It's $6,000 a month. And it's like 2015 Alex would have literally thrown up when he heard that number. But I basically said to myself, like, this is a really important exercise, because if I can't invest in myself when rationally I shouldn't be worried about paying for this service, then what is the point of making money if I'm not going to invest in myself and my family? And so I brought this up with him. And, he asked me this question of like, do you actually worry he was like, I want to get this out on the table first. Do you worry financially about paying for this service? Like, do you think actually it's going to make you go broke, like lead to other really painful trade-offs in life? And I said, no, I do not. And he said, okay, first thing I'm going to say to you is I'm not going to ever sell you and continue to work with me. But what I will say is, even if you decide to leave me so you cannot pay the $6,000 anymore, I want you to actually understand where it is coming from, because otherwise you're going to find the next opportunity next time where you have to pay $6,000 for something, and you're just going to have the same pattern or behavior. And so we went through it, and he basically asked me, like, why do you think it is? What do you think it is driving this anxiety around not being about paying me this amount each month? And I said, I think it is because I started by talking about it. I was like, I think it's because of this feeling that I don't believe in my abilities to build businesses. And I believe the way that when I stepped out of Morning Brew, like I shared before, that I have this amount that I made from the sale of our business, that is going to be the amount that I only ever make. And so I have to do everything possible to hoard it, protect it at all costs, because that's all there will ever be. And he asked me to share, like, why do you believe you can't build a good business? And I tell this story of, I have this story that my co-founder did not find me valuable, that he felt like I was dead weight. I literally visualized like I was Bernie from Weekend at Bernie's, and he was just like holding me up while building the company. And because I have that story, I don't believe I have actually any of the tools to build a great business. So one thing I'll share is when I told him that story, he said, well, do you know if that's your co-founder's story? Like, have you ever asked him? And I said, no. And he said, well, I'm going to ask you to ask him. And he was like, when are you going to ask him by? I was like, by next session. So I had a 2.5 hour conversation asking my co-founder what his story was of me from the business. What I will say is, any co-founder, any person who has someone close in their life, who has existing stories of what the other person thinks, it is one of the most powerful exercises to call out the story and to see how close or not close you are. But then basically my coach was like, okay, one, I want you to realize that everything you've just shared is a belief, and it's a belief you believe to be true, but it's not true. It's a story you've had for your entire life, and you believe so deeply in it that you just treat it as truth. But the second thing I want you to think about is, what is the cost of having this belief? What is the cost of you not believing in yourself, of you not believing you have the tools to create any outcome you want to create? What's the cost on your marriage? What is the cost on your future kids? And I said, well, the cost on my marriage is that I'm going to continue to say to myself that I have to work hard, not smart, because I'm not effective in my work. So I have to spend more hours doing it, which is going to cause me to be less present to my marriage. Because even when I'm at the dinner table with my wife, I'm going to be working, because I feel like that is a justification for overcoming my inabilities or lack of intelligence. So it'll put a distance between my presence and my marriage. And for my kid, when I have kids, me not having self-belief in my abilities will turn into me modeling lack of self-belief and lack of self-confidence, which he's like, and what will that do to your kids? The odds are that it'll give them also lack of self-belief and lack of self-confidence. And so I thought it was just such a powerful exercise, because I don't think people appreciate that when they do things, even that they acknowledge are extrinsically driven or fear-driven, I don't think they actually appreciate all of the non-business or professional related impacts that it has on their life by having these stories. And so I think actually uncovering these stories and understanding the true cost of them, the non-financial costs, is actually the most powerful exercise people can do.
I love that example, and it fits really neatly with the whole idea of premeditation. That's essentially, you've just described one of the most powerful parts of premeditation is exactly that. I love the adding in, well, go ask your co-founder what his story or her story is about you. And
Yep.
you're going to find that many, many times it is not even close to the story that you're telling yourself. I had as a guest Will Storr, who I discovered through a book. Our family has a commingled Kindle, and somebody else had bought this book, Scientific Storytelling by Will Storr. I'm like, oh, this looks like a good book. And so I read it, and like, this guy's a genius, because essentially what he does is exactly what you just went through, right? Because we tell a story like propaganda, really easy, repetition, repetition, repetition. That's all you got to do, and people will believe the craziest shit, right? Just keep repeating it. And what Storr unlocks in his book is, guess what? You're the author here. You get to write a whole different story if you want to. And and that is a really insightful thing. And it amazes me that more people, why do you think, like, I'm sure you've shared this story with other people. Do you find when people are reticent to embrace that, what is that just another story they're telling themselves?
Yeah. I think it's one, I think our reptilian brains love comfortability. Like, I think if we play that, put the hat on me as the reptilian brain hat, it says, I've done a pretty damn good job of the last 30 years. Alex has stayed alive. And, however I've done it, he stayed alive. So I'm going to just do the same exact thing for the next 30 years, because that's my goal. I want to just keep him alive. So I just think that there's like this deep discomfort with uncomfortable things, because it poses a risk to stasis, and stasis has been proven to work for us in the past. I also think people feel like it's, this idea of like manifestation or changing your stories. Like, I think it's really unfortunate. I think it just like suffers from like a branding problem, because people think it's like, feels like spiritual or woo woo, but like it really is. Like, at the end of the day, it's like, if you believe in propaganda, if you believe that you can create a story and repeat it over and over in society and people will believe it, what changes about that mental model to say the same thing for yourself? That if you have this story you've repeated over and over, why wouldn't you believe it? And I don't think people just appreciate that. And I do think there's actually like opportunity to rebrand the changing of beliefs and stories in ourselves. And, one other thing I just want to share that relates to kind of to bookend like my journey of kind of refinding identity and motivation and self-confidence post-brew acquisition is there's another exercise that I did that's, again, part of Conscious Leadership Group. And the exercise is focused on finding your zone of genius. And zone of genius actually in some ways it's kind of similar to like, Ikigai, where zone of genius is basically two things. It's the skills or activities that you spend time on, that you are exceptional at, and time melts away. Okay. People understand that, but then the next question is like, how do I know what that is? How do I find that? And I find that there are two great ways to find that, and it's how I've done it. The first is this thing called the Best Stuff exercise by Conscious Leadership Group. And there's a PDF that people can fill out. And by the way, I have no affiliation with the group. I found it very helpful. Basically, this exercise, the Best Stuff exercise, it's a few steps. All it says is, first, list out 8 experiences in your life, whether it's work, whether it's relationships, whether it was when you were a kid or as an adult, where you felt like you were crushing what you were doing and you were loving the thing that you were crushing. And so you go through the exercise. I wrote down 8 things. I'll share a few examples. One was me moderating a panel with Andy Dunn, the former CEO of Bonobos, when he had his book launch event for his book Burn Rate. The second one was me pitching the CMO of JP Morgan on working with Morning Brew back in 2016, when I was by far the most junior, most unknown person in the room. The third is me building the Taj Mahal behind my right shoulder out of Legos. And That's like one not at all tied to work. And one more would be me talking to the founder of a business that I angel invested in, him talking me through a really difficult personnel challenge, and us spending 45 minutes on the phone, just like workshopping how to think about this problem. And so you write down these 8 things, and then you write summaries for each of the things, where you write what was your involvement in the activity, what do you believe you're excelling at, and why did you love what you were doing? And so you write those all down. Then the third step is you find themes. What are themes you can draw out of these 8 or 9 experiences that are completely disparate in the context of your life? And for me, I wrote down like 6 or 7 themes. It's invention, it is storytelling, it is coaching, and there are a few others. And then the final step is you take these themes and you basically synthesize a hypothesis of what is your zone of genius, what is kind of like your calling based on the things where you felt most alive and you've excelled most. And the sentence I wrote was mastering, coaching, creativity, and storytelling through the vehicle of business. And so I did that exercise, and then basically my way of testing against that exercise is I went to 3 or 4 people who know me really well in my life, and I asked them a set of questions. One of them was my co-founder, Austin, and in that discussion I had with him, I asked him these questions. I said, what are my 1 or 2 superpowers? What are my 1 or 2 Achilles heels while running the business with you? When did I look most alive in the business? When did I look least alive? When was I most helpful over the journey of our company? When was I least helpful? And basically, I got answers to all those questions, and I compared them against my hypothesis, and things were pretty spot on. And so I just found that to be a highly valuable exercise, that because something I often do is I ruminate on this question of how much am I extrinsically driven by things? How much is it truly intrinsic versus extrinsic? I think one of the best ways to get out of that kind of circular reference, because you don't actually ever know the answer of how much is it driven by money, how much is actually driven by growth, is by doing this exercise of like, when did people see you at your most energetic, where you're not the judge of it? And then you compare it to this kind of self-assessment you did on your own.
Yeah, brilliant. And I one of the reasons I was so looking forward to this conversation is we are so simpatico on so many ideas. Another one that I found helpful that I managed to learn early on was I learned the ability to treat myself as another person. And I would say, okay, if I was looking at Tom over there, what advice would I give Tom? And it's really interesting because the first couple of times you do it, you feel just like an idiot, right? Jim, you're actually talking about yourself, you dumb fucker. But the more you do it, the more that illusion takes hold, and that person you can name. I find naming them something other than yourself is very helpful. Sometimes making them a different sex is also helpful. But making them so other from you, that it really kind of takes.
I love that.
Yeah, and some of the stuff that comes out is like, holy shit, right? Because we are so much better at seeing the flaws and or strengths in other people, and for some reason we have this blindness to our own skills and deficiencies. Much more often, our deficiencies is what we're absolutely blind to. And because, like the Lake Wobegon effect, Garrison Keillor's mythical place where all the women are good looking, all the men are handsome, and all the children are above average, right? And like when you look at all the surveys, men are particularly guilty of this. Like, sir, please rate your athletic ability. Everyone's in the top 10 or 20%.
Absolutely.
Whereas I know I'm in barrel number 10.
Yeah. So it's so funny. I feel like I suffer from the opposite side of the spectrum where, and I don't know if this is kind of like falling within the vein of comparison is the enemy of contentment. And I'm always kind of, using people who are exceptional as a reference point in a thing where I feel less exceptional. But actually, I think this was one of the things I realized even in my discussion with my co-founder is I had this story of myself that was, Alex was, started this thing, and for the first few months he got it off the ground, but then he brought co-founder on and he wasn't helpful basically ever after that. And I think what I actually find that stories oftentimes can have truth to them, but they are caricatures of what the real truth is. And so like the real truth of the story, as it was told to me, is Alex was at his best and his highest leverage in the first 4 or 5 years of the business, where what was required to build a company was willing the thing into existence, to having uncanny belief for a thing that didn't really exist yet, for having product obsession to create this kind of new category of product that didn't exist. When things shifted to, it's more about process, it's more about scaling, it's more about building out a leadership team, it's more about having the operating system. That's where Alex lost leverage, because he wasn't doing the things that came most naturally or excitingly to him. And I think what's interesting is, right, that second story is the story that I latched onto, where I just lost leverage as a co-founder or CEO because I had this story that you look at Bill Gates, you look at Elon, you look at any of these founders that basically went from, garage to ringing the opening bell. And you're like, well, they scaled as a CEO. Like, clearly that is what you have to do. And I took all emphasis away from the first 4 or 5 years, which is actually where I was kind of living in my brilliance and living in my zone. Like, I completely just discounted it to zero. And I think part of the reason also is because it's a distant memory from now. It was, 5 or 6 years ago now, but also to that point of there's a certain brain, which my brain actually does. It's so much easier to focus on the places where I felt inadequate.
Yeah. And the other interesting thing about that is we often naturally discount within ourselves talents that because we possess them, we think, oh, well, everyone must be good at this, right? And it's that whole, you mentioned earlier, work hard versus work smart. Like, I was always a work smart person. I kind of thought, well, everyone's a work smart. No,
not at all.
Absolutely not.
You are in the amazing minority because, I always was like the person who had the cliche of like, I'm kind of, I would always tell the story. I'm average intelligence, and so I need to compensate with above average work ethic. And so I think to be in the camp that's working smart, I think it's an amazingly aspirational thing for most people. I think the other thing about kind of all of this is, like we said, we discount ourselves on the things that we're actually good at. And something that my co-founder said to me was, when we were first starting Morning Brew, I had never met someone in my life who was so persistent in making things happen for themselves, like in getting things to happen. And I'd never met someone who was so unapologetic about what we were building, even though maybe there wasn't reason to be so confident in it. And to your point, it's like, I would have never necessarily described myself as incredibly resourceful and scrappy or, someone who didn't give a shit what other people thought. But obviously that is something that is just like, that is my way of being. And I think it takes talking to other people to realize your way of being may not be the common way of being.
Totally. I could talk to you forever, man. And I'm already looking at an hour and a half, but I do want to ask specifically about Storyarb, because it is really close to something we're spinning up over at O'Shaughnessy Ventures. So I want to compare notes. What gave you the idea, and how are you thinking about executing against it?
Yeah. So, like I said, this all plays within my desire to any companies that, at least in the beginning, I don't have to raise venture funding for. I can cash flow them pretty quickly. And then but that doesn't necessarily change the ambition of the business. It maybe just changes what is the at least starting point or the starting business model. So the idea for Storyarb came about because one day I was just sitting and I was on Twitter doom scrolling like I do, and I saw someone talking about their new short form video agency. And I just had this thought. And by the way, I had talked to someone who had a short form video agency a week prior, and he had shared with me how churn was like the hardest part of his business, how like they would churn through 40% of their clients every 2 months. And I was like, that sounds fucking miserable. And I thought about it, and basically the thought I had is like, I feel like short form video agencies are in vogue right now because a lot of people want to be creating short form content. They don't necessarily have the editing chops to do it. There's this huge offshore arbitrage that's happening of using talent in the Philippines or Sri Lanka to create your content. But it feels like a race to the bottom because it feels like the service will be commoditized and you can't actually track ROI for a client. How is a client going to actually think to themselves, I can justify this $3,000 every month if it's just based on impressions versus driving actual relationships or business? And so then I had this thought of like, Twitter and LinkedIn are pretty awesome for driving opportunities. Like all my opportunities have come through my Twitter and my LinkedIn, but I don't really know of agencies that have used that as the starting point. And I actually think it can be easier to actually drive ROI, like truly attach leads and revenue to content you are putting out on these text-based platforms. And so the idea came to me, and like my way of building businesses is to do it out in the open and just continue to kind of like scale up risk as I get validation. So the first thing I did, I literally posted on Twitter about Storyarb. It didn't even have a name yet. There was no business. I just said, I think I said, if you're interested in taking your knowledge and turning that into content on Twitter or LinkedIn to build your personal brand, you're willing to spend $5,000 to $10,000 per month. And I think you're a CEO or an exec, and there's like one other filter, DM me. I got like 15 DMs. So I was like, okay, there's demand. Now I'm going to go look for supply. I did a tweet the next day and I said, if you are a writer who wants to write for executives who are looking to build their audience on social, DM me. I got a bunch of DMs. And then for the first few months, all I did is I made it a matchmaking process where I basically paired writer who I'd qualified with executive. And I said to the writer, I said, tell me what you charge for a client. I'm going to just pass through the entire cost to you. I just want to sit in a Slack channel and watch everything you do for a month or 2 months. So that's what I did. The initial clients paid $3,000 a month. They passed it to our ghostwriter. Like I didn't even have them wired to my bank account. I just gave my ghostwriter's bank account to them. And I just observed. And then I said to myself, okay, what is everything I can take off of the writer's plate? So they are just focusing on the creative aspect of the job. Everything administrative or content strategy or reporting on analytics related, I will handle as basically the account manager. So there were a few months where basically that arrangement existed where I got to 4 or 5 clients. I was conducting content interviews with these executives. I was sharing that with the ghostwriter. I was handling payments, setting content strategy, checking how many leads I was driving for clients, et cetera. And then we got to a point where basically I was like a full-time content strategist. And I was like, okay, now's probably the time to hire a CEO. And I had traction where my thought was there's enough legitimacy here where I could hire a very good operator of the business. So then I tweeted out and LinkedIn posted out, I'm looking for a CEO for this business, for Storyarb. Meanwhile, by the way, there was not a website at all. There still is not a website for the company. It still does not, there's no website for the company today. And I got 70 candidates. I narrowed it down to 7 people who I took through an interview process. One person I thought was the person. I put them through a contract to full-time process for a month. They were the operating CEO of the business. And basically, that was the starting point. Now, what is the thesis for Storyarb? Very simply, I want to build what I describe as the media company for the personal media company for the modern executive. So for the professional who has deep industry insight, specifically a B2B executive, venture investor, private equity investor, real estate investor, my whole view is what we were talking about before, which is actually the best industry professionals have not built any brand on social because they're too busy building great companies. I actually think like the mediocre people like me are the ones building brands on social. And so my view is if I can actually help exceptional professionals become creators, but being a creator is not a full-time job for them, we can start with LinkedIn and Twitter. Then we can grow into other rented audiences, whether that's short form video. Sure, we'll throw that into the mix. Then we move down into owned audience, like email, podcast, or communities for the niche that they're in. And then what I get really excited about is actual like businesses, monetized audience. And so I'll use an example for you. One of our first clients is, I'll call him like the next Nick Huber. He's a self-storage developer and investor, amazing guy. And we've been working with him for 5 or 6 months. And we've doubled his audience, which is great. But actually what matters more is who that audience is and what's been driven from it. So 10,000, so let's say he has 12,000 followers. Of that, 10,000 of them are real estate investors or developers. Super high value audience, right? Like I think it's in a lot of ways how Patrick thinks about the quality of audience across the podcast network, right? For Colossus. And so basically with him, we built up this great social audience and we're also driving leads. So we've gotten a ton of inbound investor interest for his funds. So like he can attribute ROI to Storyarb. But now what I'm thinking about is how do we take over his newsletter? So now how do we funnel these people into email, build an ongoing relationship for people who want to go deeper in self-storage? But what I get really excited about is what's a business I can launch with him? How do I go to him and say, hey, we've built an owned audience for you. Let's actually treat you like we treated me for Storyarb, where I give you half of this business, you give me half, I go find a person to run this business. We figure out the idea for the business by testing your audience, putting ideas out into the world, just like I did with Storyarb. And we built, for you look at it as effectively passive income. Maybe there's a few hours each month where you have to dedicate to the business, but that's it. And it potentially helps reinforce like the fund or the investment business you're building. So an example for him would be like, what does it look like to launch a YPO or a Hampton for self-storage investors? What does it look like to launch the first trade show for self-storage investors? And all of a sudden, if you're known as the guy who not only has these new lines of business, you're also seeing more deal flow, you're seeing more properties, et cetera. And now I've built up distribution for every new business I'm launching.
Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. We'll be stealing all of that from you for...
Please do.
Well, listen, Alex, this has been actually surpassed my expectations. This has been so much fun. And if you have listened to our podcast in the past, you know that at the end, what we do is we wave a magic wand and we make you emperor of the world. Only a couple of rules around that. You can't kill anybody and you can't put anyone in a re-education camp. But what you can do is we're going to hand you a magical microphone and you can speak 2 things into that microphone. And the 2 things that you speak will incept the entire population of the world, 8 billion people. Whenever their tomorrow is, they're going to wake up and say to themselves or their spouse or their significant other, I've just had 2 of the greatest ideas in the world, and I'm going to act on each one of them, not just think about them. What 2 things are you going to incept in the world's population?
This is going to probably, I'm going to get called out from the woo-woo crowd, but I think if I actually thought to myself, I have the power for every person in the world to have 2 thoughts, to live life in a certain way. It feels cringy to say it, but I think it is what's true to me, which is like, if every person could wake up tomorrow and believe and it's the reality that they love themselves. And then the second is that they choose to love others. I think everything would be way better. I think, the way that I think about it is like, we're building so many incredible things in the world, but if we do not have people who have self-belief and what's going on up here being in a good place for themselves, and also if they do not have empathy and love for others, what's the point of all of it? And so, yeah, I love myself and I love others is how I would choose for everyone on this planet to operate through life.
I love it. And there you go. So you already incepted me, man. I love you.
I love you too. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, Alex. You will definitely be on our return guest roster because this was so much fun.
Love it. I'm excited for the return tour.
All right, Alex. Thanks so much.
Thank you.